I never imagined that 3 ordinary parking spaces would turn into the biggest legal and personal battle of my adult life. But sometimes people don't steal your property because they need it. They steal it because they think you won't fight back. And the funny part is that the people who always tell you to follow the rules are usually the first ones to ignore them when power makes them comfortable. My name is Ethan Marshall. I'm 35 years old. And for most of my career, I've been the kind of guy who fixes problems by opening a laptop instead of raising my voice. I work as a software architect outside Raleigh, North Carolina. And if you ask my friends to describe me, they'd probably tell you I'm painfully organized. I save receipts, scan documents, label folders, and read contracts that nobody else bothers reading. My wife used to joke that if we ever lost our marriage certificate, I'd probably have 3 backups stored in different cloud accounts. Back in 2020, when we bought our townhouse in a neighborhood called Brookhaven Village, we weren't looking for luxury. We wanted quiet streets, decent schools, and a place where our future kids could ride bikes without worrying about speeding traffic. The neighborhood looked perfect, lined with neat sidewalks, trimmed bushes, identical mailboxes, and those little American flags people leave outside after the 4th of July because nobody ever bothers taking them down. The real estate agent smiled through the entire tour and said, "The HOA keeps everything beautiful." At the time, that sounded like a selling point. Looking back now, it sounds more like a warning label. During closing, my attorney highlighted something that barely caught my attention. The property included 3 designated parking spaces directly beside the townhouse. They weren't common spaces assigned by courtesy. They were legally attached to my deed. He tapped the paperwork and said, "These belong to you exactly the same way your backyard belongs to you." I nodded, signed everything, and honestly never thought about it again, because why would I? Nobody expects to wake up one day and discover someone voted themselves ownership of part of your property. A week after moving in, I introduced myself to several neighbors. Most were friendly, bringing cookies or waving while walking their dogs. Then I met the HOA president, a retired commercial developer named Richard Calloway. He had silver hair, polished shoes that somehow never got dirty, and the confidence of someone who had spent decades telling people what they could and couldn't do. I handed him copies of my survey because he asked for community records. He glanced over them, smiled politely, and said, "Everything looks good. Welcome to Brookhaven." That should have been the end of our interaction, but people like Richard never really stop collecting information. They just file it away until it's useful. For almost 4 years, nothing happened. Life moved on. I'd leave early for work, come home after dark, grill burgers on weekends, help my elderly neighbor Mrs. Delgado carry groceries inside, and wave to kids riding scooters past my driveway. The HOA sent the usual emails reminding everyone about trash cans and lawn height, and I ignored most of them because none applied to me. Then one rainy Monday afternoon, everything changed. I drove home after sitting through 3 hours of meetings and found bright orange construction cones sitting across my parking spaces. At first I laughed because I assumed some contractor had made a mistake. There's also a laminated sign zip-tied to one cone that read, "Temporary Community Visitor Parking." I looked around expecting workers nearby, but the street was quiet except for birds and the sound of sprinklers. So I moved the cones onto the sidewalk, parked my truck, and went inside thinking nothing more about it. The next morning I walked outside with my coffee and nearly spilled it. The cones were back, except now there were more of them, and someone had painted fresh white lines around my spaces overnight. The same sign was there, only larger. I took pictures, emailed the HOA, and then called Richard directly. He answered on the 4th ring with the relaxed tone of a man discussing the weather. "Morning, Ethan." I asked him why community signs were sitting on my property. He didn't hesitate. The board voted to redesignate those spaces for visitor overflow. I actually laughed because I thought he was joking. "Richard, those aren't HOA spaces." He replied, "The neighborhood needs them more than one homeowner does." I remember standing there in complete silence because my brain couldn't process the sentence. Finally, I asked, "Did you read my deed?" He paused just long enough to sound annoyed before saying, "Community interests sometimes outweigh individual preferences." Preferences. That's the word he used. Like owning property was somehow a lifestyle choice instead of a legal fact. I went back inside, pulled out my closing binder, spread every document across the dining room table, and spent hours reading while my wife watched quietly from the kitchen. She finally asked, "Tell me you're finding something good." I looked up and smiled for the first time all day. I'm finding that they have absolutely no idea what they've done. Because there was in black and white, complete with survey coordinates, legal descriptions, and county records proving those 3 parking spaces belonged to our property and had since the neighborhood was built. The more I read, the calmer I became, and anyone who knows me will tell you that's usually the moment people should start worrying. Because I don't get even when I'm angry, I get organized, and before I went to bed that night, I wasn't thinking about revenge anymore. I was thinking about permanence, visibility, and a lesson that nobody on that HOA board would ever forget. The next morning, I didn't rush to call a lawyer or threaten anyone, because that's exactly what Richard expected me to do. Instead, I drove to work, sat through meetings, answered emails, and spent my lunch break calling the county recorder's office, a local property attorney I'd worked with years before, and a survey company that still had digital copies of my original documents. And by the time I drove home, I had something much more valuable than anger. I had certainty. The attorney chuckled after listening to my story and said, "Ethan, they can vote on landscaping, paint colors, and community rules, but they can't hold an election and magically transfer ownership of your deeded property. That's not how reality works." Those words stayed in my head all evening. My wife, Lauren, looked across the dinner table and asked what we were going to do, and I told her something that surprised even me. "We're not going to chase them. We're going to make them come to us." She smiled because she knew that look on my face. She had seen it before when I rebuilt a software project everyone thought was impossible to save. I don't panic. I build systems. And suddenly this wasn't just a dispute anymore. It was a system waiting to fail under its own bad design. Over the next 2 weeks, I quietly gathered information. I walked the neighborhood at different times of day. I watched traffic patterns. I noticed delivery drivers using the same route, kids riding bikes through the same opening, neighbors cutting across the pavement to reach their garages. Then one afternoon, a heavy rainstorm rolled through, and something clicked. Water pooled along the alternative access road behind several buildings until it looked more like a shallow creek than a street. Cars stopped and turned around. People parked blocks away and carried groceries through ankle-deep water. I asked Mrs. Delgado how long that had been happening. She shrugged and said, "Every decent storm for years." Then she added something that changed everything. "Your parking area is really the only dry access point." I went home and pulled up satellite maps, drainage plans, and old engineering documents available through public records. Sure enough, the layout made my property the practical gateway to more than 20 homes whenever the weather turned bad. Richard hadn't stolen 3 parking spaces. He had unknowingly built his own dependence on them. Once I understood that, spending money didn't feel like an expense anymore. It felt like an investment. I hired a contractor named Mike, a former Marine who believed every project should survive both hurricanes and bad neighbors. When I explained what I wanted, he looked over the survey stakes and asked, "So you want a fence?" I shook my head. "No, I want certainty made out of steel." He laughed and said, "Now that's a customer." We designed an 8-foot black steel gate with reinforced posts set in deep concrete, an automatic opener, keypad entry, security cameras, motion lighting, and tasteful signs that simply read private property authorized vehicles only. No insults, no sarcasm, just facts. The installation happened on a Saturday, while most people were out shopping or watching college football. Neighbors slowed their cars to stare. Kids rode by twice pretending they weren't curious. Mrs. Delgado sat on her porch with lemonade and gave me a thumbs up every hour. Around noon, Richard drove past in his golf cart, stopped, removed his sunglasses, and stared without saying a word. I nodded politely. He drove away. By evening, the gate stood finished, clean and professional, looking less like a protest and more like it had always belonged there. Before going inside, I placed laminated copies of the deed, the certified survey, and the relevant county property description inside weatherproof display, sleeves attached beside the entrance. If anyone questioned ownership, they could educate themselves without knocking on my door. Monday morning started with the sound of someone pounding on my front door hard enough to rattle the windows. I opened it to find Richard accompanied by 3 board members and a maintenance supervisor whose expression suggested he wished he were somewhere else. Richard pointed toward the gate. "Take that down immediately." I asked why. He blinked, apparently unprepared for such a simple question. "Because it's against HOA regulations." I replied. "Can you show me which regulation allows the HOA to occupy private property without permission?" He ignored the question. "You're obstructing community access." "Community access to whose land?" I asked. His face reddened. One board member, a woman named Sheila, stepped forward and tried a softer approach. "Ethan, we're all neighbors here. We need to think about what's best for everyone." I nodded. "Exactly. That's why I'm respecting property boundaries. I hope the board starts doing the same." Richard jabbed a finger toward me. "You'll be fined every single day until this comes down." I calmly reached into my folder and handed him a printed copy of the county statute my attorney had highlighted. "You should read page 3. He looked at it for only a few seconds before handing it back. "That's your interpretation." I smiled. "Actually, it's North Carolina's interpretation." For a moment, nobody spoke. The maintenance supervisor finally muttered, "He's got a point," then immediately looked at the ground after Richard shot him a glare sharp enough to cut glass. They left promising legal action, but nothing happened that week except more rain. Then more people started noticing what the board had created. Residents who once drove across the area found themselves forced onto the flooded route behind the buildings. One father pushed a stroller through standing water while balancing grocery bags on his shoulders. A teenager slipped carrying sports equipment and landed in muddy runoff. Videos appeared on neighborhood Facebook groups. At first, comments blamed the weather. Then someone posted a picture of my gate alongside the deed documents displayed in plain sight. Suddenly, the conversation changed. People started asking why the HOA had claimed private property in the first place. Another resident wrote, "If that's his land, why are we being told it's ours?" The answers from a board grew shorter and more defensive. Richard sent out an email describing the issue as a temporary misunderstanding, but screenshots spread faster than explanations. Local reporters love stories involving neighborhood politics because everyone has experienced difficult neighbors, and before long, a small news station contacted several residents. They interviewed a mother standing beside pooled water while children splashed through it wearing school shoes. The headline that evening wasn't flattering. It asked why an HOA had attempted to use privately owned land as community infrastructure. My phone buzzed nonstop with messages from coworkers who had seen the clip. One text simply read, "Dude, is this your gate on TV?" Meanwhile, the atmosphere inside Brookhaven Village shifted in ways I never expected. People who had barely spoken to me before now waved when they walked past. Some apologized for assuming the board knew what it was doing. Others quietly admitted Richard had been making increasingly aggressive decisions for years, and nobody challenged him, because arguing with the HOA usually meant months of headaches. Mrs. Delgado told me she had lived there for 12 years and had never seen residents so united. "Bullies always look strong," she whispered, until someone says no. I still wasn't celebrating because experience has taught me that pride can ruin good strategy. Instead, I kept documenting everything. Every email, every photograph, every conversation went into organized folders with dates and timestamps. My cameras recorded every visitor approaching the gate. The funny thing was that the gate itself never caused problems. It simply forced reality to become visible, and reality was making the board look worse every single day. Then, one Friday afternoon, just as I was shutting down my computer at work, my phone lit up with Richard's name. I stared at the screen for several seconds before answering, and the confidence that had filled his voice only weeks earlier was gone, replaced by something much quieter. He cleared his throat and said, "Ethan, perhaps it's time we discuss a solution that benefits everyone." The moment he spoke those words, I realized the fight had entered an entirely different stage. Because people who believe they hold all the power never ask for a conversation unless they've already lost something they thought they controlled. I met Richard the following Monday at a small coffee shop just outside the neighborhood because he insisted we should handle this privately, which sounded ironic coming from the man who had tried to turn my property into public parking. He arrived 10 minutes late carrying a leather folder and wearing the same confident smile that had disappeared during our phone call, but now seemed carefully rehearsed. After a few minutes of awkward small talk, he slid a document across the table and said, "The board is prepared to lease those spaces from you for $1,200 a month on a 7-year agreement. This resolves the access issue and shows the community we're working together." I looked at the paper, then looked back at him. A month earlier, he had acted as though those spaces already belonged to the HOA. Now he was offering to rent them from me. That alone would have been satisfying enough, but life has a strange sense of timing. I closed the folder without signing it and said, "Richard, I appreciate the offer, but you're too late." He frowned. "What do you mean?" I reached into my bag and handed him another agreement, this one already signed. He scanned the first page, then the second, and the color slowly drained from his face. The contract wasn't with the HOA. It was with Ridgestone Community Services, a regional property management company that had been trying for 2 years to convince Brookhaven residents they could run the neighborhood more professionally than the current management team. Their representatives had contacted me after seeing the local news story, asking whether my property could legally host a temporary information office. I had spoken with my attorney, reviewed zoning requirements, verified every detail, and signed a completely lawful 7-year lease. Richard looked up and whispered, "You're joking." I shook my head. "No, they're moving in on Wednesday." He pushed his chair back and actually laughed once, but it wasn't the laugh of someone amused. It was the laugh people make when reality refuses to negotiate with their expectations. "The board will never allow this." I answered calmly, "The board doesn't own my property." He stood, collected his folder, and walked away without finishing his coffee. Wednesday morning arrived with perfect weather. A clean white mobile office trailer rolled into my parking area, escorted by 2 pickup trucks and several employees wearing company shirts. Within hours, they had installed flower pots, folding chairs, a canopy for shade, and a professionally printed banner facing the neighborhood entrance. The words were impossible to ignore. "Tired of poor HOA management? Ask us how communities can do better." The placement was completely legal, tasteful, and highly visible. Residents walking dogs stopped to chat. Parents waiting for school buses accepted brochures. Elderly homeowners sat under the canopy asking questions about budgeting, maintenance, and transparency. Nobody was forced to attend. They came because curiosity travels faster than advertising. The irony that made me smile every morning was the location. Richard's front door sat only a short walk away, meaning every time he left for work, picked up his mail, or drove to a board meeting, he passed the banner reminding everyone that another option existed. I never celebrated publicly because the situation wasn't about humiliating him. It was about proving that abusing authority creates consequences you cannot always reverse. Over the following months, the neighborhood atmosphere changed. Board meetings became crowded. Financial reports were questioned. Residents who had never spoken during elections suddenly demanded explanations. Some still defended Richard, arguing he had simply made a mistake while trying to help the community. Others insisted the real mistake wasn't taking my parking spaces, but believing one person's rights could disappear because a committee found them inconvenient. I listened more than I talked because by then the documents, videos, and contracts spoke louder than I ever could. The lease payments arrived exactly as scheduled, month after month, and the agreement included a substantial late payment penalty that Ridgestone insisted on adding because they valued certainty as much as I did. Friends asked whether I felt victorious, but the truth was more complicated. Winning doesn't erase stress. It doesn't give back the sleepless nights or the weekends spent reading legal documents while wondering whether standing your ground is worth the cost. What it does give you is peace, the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you respected the law, even when others expected you to surrender. Sometimes I would sit on my porch in the evening while Mrs. Delgado watered her flowers, and she'd grin before saying, "Funny how they called you selfish for protecting your own property." I'd laugh because she was right. The easiest way to make reasonable people look unreasonable is to demand they give up something that already belongs to them, then criticize them for saying no. As for Richard, he stopped calling. We occasionally crossed paths at community events, exchanging polite nods like strangers who once knew each other too well. Maybe he still believes the whole situation could have ended differently. Maybe he's right. All it would have taken was one honest conversation before someone decided that a vote mattered more than a deed. Instead, a simple act of overreach created years of consequences that everyone in the neighborhood could see every single day. And that's why whenever people ask me what the biggest lesson was, I tell them this. Documents matter, patience matters, but the courage to calmly defend what's yours matters even more, because power often counts on silence. And the moment silence disappears, the balance changes. So now I'm curious about what you think. If an HOA or any local board claimed your private property for the good of the community, would you compromise, would you fight in court, or would you find a completely different solution the way I did? Let me know in the comments, because stories like this are never just about parking spaces or fences. They're about where fairness ends and authority begins. And sometimes the most unforgettable victories are the ones achieved without raising your voice at all.